The crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead as servers moved quietly through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne and appetizers that cost more than most people earned in a week. Richard Coleman stood in the center of his penthouse living room, laughing loudly at something one of his business partners had said. Everything about the evening screamed success. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the Manhattan skyline, and every piece of furniture had been carefully selected to remind visitors that they were in the home of someone who had made it big. Richard was 38 years old and had built his fortune in technology. He had sold his first company for millions and used that money to invest in startups that made him even wealthier. Now he lived in a world where everything came easy. People laughed at his jokes whether they were funny or not. Beautiful people wanted to be seen with him, and he had convinced himself that his success made him better than everyone else. Tonight's dinner party was important. He had invited 12 carefully chosen guests. There were potential investors, a journalist from a major business magazine, and several socialites who could spread word about his lifestyle. Everything needed to be perfect. The food was catered by a Michelin-starred chef. The wine came from his private collection. Even the music playing softly in the background had been curated by someone he paid handsomely for such services. Working quietly in the background was his housekeeper, Elena. She had been with him for about 3 months now. Richard barely noticed her most days, which was exactly how he preferred his staff to be. Invisible until needed, Elena was probably in her early 50s, with gray streaks in her dark hair that she kept pulled back in a simple bun. She wore the standard uniform he required, and she moved through his home with a quiet efficiency that he appreciated, because it meant he never had to think about her. Elena had been refilling water, glasses, and clearing empty plates throughout the evening. She never spoke unless spoken to, and she had perfected the art of being present without drawing attention to herself. Richard had no idea where she was from, what her story was, or really anything about her beyond the fact that she showed up on time and did her work well enough that he didn't need to find a replacement. The dinner portion of the evening had ended, and now the guests were mingling in the living room area. Richard was in the middle of telling a story about his latest acquisition when Patricia, one of the wealthy socialites, walked over to the grand piano sitting in the corner of the room. "Richard, darling?" she called out, running her fingers along the polished surface of the instrument. "I had no idea you played piano. This is a gorgeous Steinway." Richard walked over, drink in hand, and smiled. "I don't actually play. I bought it because the designer said the room needed something in that corner. It's worth about $200,000, so it makes for good conversation." Patricia laughed, the kind of laugh that people do at parties when they don't want to admit something isn't actually funny. $200,000 for decoration? That's deliciously excessive. A few other guests gathered around admiring the instrument. One of them, a businessman named Gregory, lifted the keyboard cover and pressed a few keys. The sound was pure and rich, exactly what you would expect from such an expensive instrument. "Shame to let it sit here unused," Gregory said. "Anyone here play?" There was a moment of awkward silence as people looked at each other. Then Richard, feeling the champagne giving him courage and a twisted sense of humor, had what he thought was a brilliant idea. His eyes landed on Elena, who was collecting empty glasses from a side table. "Elena," he called out, his voice loud enough that everyone turned to look. "Come here for a moment." Elena froze. She set down the glasses she was holding and walked slowly toward the group. Her expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in her eyes. Wariness, perhaps, or resignation. "Yes, Mr. Coleman," she said quietly. Richard draped his arm dramatically toward the piano. "My housekeeper is going to entertain us. Elena, play something on the piano for my guests." There was scattered laughter from some of the guests. Elena's face remained still, but her hands hanging at her sides trembled slightly. "Mr. Coleman, I should continue with my work," she said softly. Nonsense. Richard was enjoying this now. He could feel the attention of the room on him, and he loved being the center of attention. "Come on, give it a try. What's the worst that could happen? You hit a few wrong notes and we all have a good laugh?" More laughter rippled through the crowd. Richard saw Patricia covering her mouth, her eyes shining with amusement. Gregory was grinning widely. Even the journalist was watching with interest, probably thinking this would make a good anecdote for his article about how the wealthy lived. "I really should not," Elena said, her accent becoming slightly more pronounced as her discomfort grew. "I insist," Richard said, and his tone left no room for argument. "You work in my home, humor us. Consider it part of your job tonight." Elena stood there for a long moment. Around her, 12 wealthy people waited to be entertained by what they assumed would be an embarrassing display. Richard was already imagining how he would tell this story later. The time he made his maid play his expensive piano. It would be hilarious. Elena looked at the piano, then at Richard, then at the faces of the guests. Something shifted in her expression. The wariness was replaced by something harder to read. She walked slowly to the piano bench and sat down. "This is cruel, Richard," Patricia whispered, but she was still smiling. "It's harmless fun," he whispered back. "Besides, she can say no if she really wants to." But Elena had not said no. She sat at the bench, her back straight, her hands hovering over the keys. The room had gone quiet now, everyone watching and waiting. Richard stood with his drink, a satisfied smile on his face. This was going exactly as he had planned. Elena closed her eyes for a brief moment. Her hands were no longer trembling. When she opened her eyes again and placed her fingers on the keys, something had changed. She no longer looked like a housekeeper who had been put on the spot. She looked like someone who belonged at that piano, and then she began to play. The first notes filled the room like water flowing into an empty vessel. It was not the fumbling, awkward attempt that everyone expected. It was beautiful, hauntingly beautiful. The melody was complex and emotional, each note perfectly placed, the dynamics rising and falling with the kind of control that took years to develop. Richard's smile faded. The laughter died completely. People stopped moving, stopped drinking, stopped whispering. They just listened. Elena's fingers moved across the keys with absolute confidence. Her whole body swayed slightly with the music, completely absorbed in what she was creating. This was not someone who had taken a few childhood lessons. This was someone who truly knew this instrument, someone who loved it. The piece built in intensity, Elena's fingers flying across the keys in passages that would challenge even skilled pianists. The emotion in the music was overwhelming. It spoke of loss, of longing, of beauty that persists even through darkness. Richard felt his face growing hot. This was not supposed to happen. He had wanted to embarrass her, to give his guests a moment of entertainment at her expense. Instead, he stood frozen, watching his housekeeper reveal herself to be something he had never imagined. When the final notes faded into silence, no one moved for several seconds. Then Gregory began to clap. Within moments, the entire room erupted into genuine, enthusiastic applause. Patricia had tears in her eyes. Elena stood up from the bench, her face composed but pale. She looked directly at Richard for just a moment, and in that look was everything she could not say out loud. Then she walked back toward the kitchen to continue her work, leaving Richard standing by his expensive piano, feeling smaller than he had in a very long time. The applause continued for what felt like forever to Richard. He stood there, his champagne glass still in his hand, watching his guests surround the piano with genuine excitement. This was not the reaction he had planned. Not even close. Patricia rushed toward the kitchen where Elena had disappeared. "Wait, please wait," she called out. Elena stopped in the doorway, still holding the tray of empty glasses she had picked up. Patricia grabbed her by the arm, not roughly, but with an urgency that made it clear she was not going to let this moment pass. "You must tell me where you studied," Patricia said, her voice filled with emotion. That was Chopin, wasn't it? The Nocturne in E-flat major. "I've heard it performed at Carnegie Hall, and you just played it as beautifully as any concert pianist I've ever seen." Elena's face remained carefully neutral, but Richard could see the way her jaw tightened. "It was a long time ago," she said simply. "A long time ago?" Gregory had joined them now, along with several other guests. "You don't play like that with old lessons. That kind of skill takes a lifetime of dedication. Who are you, really?" Richard felt something uncomfortable twisting in his stomach. He had hired Elena through an agency. He had glanced at her resume for maybe 30 seconds. Cleaning experience, references, legal to work in the country. That was all he had cared about. He had never asked her a single personal question in the 3 months she had worked for him. "I am Mr. Coleman's housekeeper," Elena said quietly. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have work to finish." She tried to move past them, but the journalist, a man named Thomas who wrote for a prestigious business magazine, stepped forward with his phone out. "Please, just one question." Where did you train? Are you a professional musician? I was, Elena said, and for the first time that evening there was an edge to her voice. Once in another life, now I clean houses. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Richard felt every eye in the room shift toward him. He was the one who had forced her to play. He was the one who had tried to humiliate her. And now he was the one standing there looking like a fool, while his housekeeper quietly revealed that she was far more cultured than he had ever bothered to discover. How extraordinary, Patricia said softly. A professional pianist working as a housekeeper. There must be quite a story there. Elena's expression finally cracked. Just for a moment, Richard saw something raw flash across her face. Pain, grief, exhaustion. Then it was gone, replaced again by that careful neutrality. There is always a story, Elena said, but stories do not pay the bills. Now please, I must work. This time when she moved toward the kitchen, people let her pass. The guests stood in awkward silence for a moment before slowly returning to their drinks and conversations. But the energy of the party had changed. People kept glancing toward the kitchen. The laughter sounded forced now. Several guests made early excuses to leave. Richard barely heard the goodbyes. He kept replaying the last hour in his mind. The way he had called Elena over, the laughter of his guests, his own smug satisfaction at putting her on the spot, and then the music. God, the music. It had been extraordinary, and he had meant it as a joke. By 11 o'clock, everyone had left except Patricia, who was one of Richard's oldest friends from college. She sat on the couch, swirling the last of her wine in her glass, and gave Richard a look he recognized. It was her disappointed look, the one she usually reserved for her teenage son when he did something particularly stupid. That was ugly. Richard, she said. I didn't know she could play, Richard said defensively. That's not the point, and you know it. Patricia set down her glass. You tried to embarrass that woman in front of a room full of strangers. Whether she could play or not doesn't change the fact that you were being cruel. Richard wanted to argue, but the words died in his throat. She was right. He knew she was right. He had spent the entire party showing off his wealth, his success, his expensive things. And when he saw a chance to elevate himself even further, by bringing someone else down, he took it without a second thought. I should apologize, he said. Yes, you should. Patricia stood up and grabbed her purse. You should do more than apologize, actually. You should figure out why you thought that was okay in the first place. After Patricia left, Richard walked slowly through his penthouse. The caterers had already cleaned up the main mess, but there were still champagne glasses scattered around, napkins on side tables, the remnants of his perfect party. He stopped in front of the piano and stared at it. $200,000. He had bought it because his interior designer said it would look impressive. He had never even had it tuned. He could hear quiet movement from the kitchen. Elena was still there, finishing the cleaning. Richard took a deep breath and walked toward the kitchen door. He had never been in his own kitchen for more than a few minutes at a time. Elena had her back to him, washing dishes by hand, even though there was a perfectly good dishwasher right next to her. Elena, he said. She turned, her face showing no emotion. Yes, Mr. Coleman. I owe you an apology. The words felt clumsy in his mouth. What I did tonight was wrong. I don't know what I was trying to do. Be entertaining, I guess. I didn't think about how it would make you feel. Elena dried her hands on a towel and looked at him directly. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. You wanted to make your guests laugh. You wanted them to see you as clever and fun, and you thought embarrassing your housekeeper was a harmless way to do that. Richard felt his face flush. I really am sorry. Are you? Elena asked. Are you sorry for what you did, or are you sorry that it didn't turn out the way you planned? The question hit harder than Richard expected. He opened his mouth to respond, but Elena continued. You have lived here for 2 years, Mr. Coleman. I have worked here for 3 months. In that time, you have never asked me one question about my life. Not where I come from, not if I have family, not even how my day is going. To you, I am invisible. I am hands that clean your home and nothing more. That's not true, Richard said, but even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. It is true, Elena said. And tonight, when you saw a chance to use me for your entertainment, you did not hesitate. Because in your mind, I am not a real person with feelings and dignity. I am just the help. Richard wanted to argue. He wanted to defend himself. But every word Elena spoke was absolutely true. He had never once thought of her as a complete human being with her own story. Her own dreams, her own past. I was a pianist, Elena said. And now there was something in her voice that Richard had never heard before. Not anger exactly, but something close to it. I performed in concert halls across Europe. I taught at a conservatory. I had a life that meant something. And then everything fell apart and I came here and I clean toilets for men like you who think they are better than me because they have money. The words landed like physical blows. Richard stood there speechless as Elena picked up her coat from the hook by the door. I will return on Monday to finish my work, she said. But I think we both know that you will find a new housekeeper soon. Men like you do not like to be reminded that the people who serve them are actually human. She walked past him and out the door, leaving Richard standing alone in his enormous kitchen, surrounded by his expensive things, feeling more empty than he had ever felt in his life. He walked back to the piano and sat down on the bench. The keys were still slightly warm from where Elena had played. He pressed one key and the note rang out pure and clear in the silent apartment. He had no idea how to play. He had never bothered to learn. It had never seemed important. For the first time in years, Richard Coleman felt truly ashamed of himself. Richard did not sleep that night. He lay in his king-sized bed staring at the ceiling, replaying Elena's words over and over in his mind. The shame he felt was unfamiliar and uncomfortable. He was used to being admired, envied, praised. He was not used to being confronted with the reality of his own cruelty. At 3 a.m, he got up and went to his office. He opened his laptop and pulled up the file the agency had sent when he hired Elena. Her full name was Elena Konstantinova, age 52, references from 2 previous employers, both giving her excellent ratings for reliability and quality of work. That was it. That was everything he knew about the woman who had been coming to his home 3 times a week for 3 months. Richard sat back in his chair, feeling disgusted with himself. He thought about all the other people who worked for him or around him. His assistant, his driver, the doorman in his building, the people who prepared his food at restaurants. How many of them had he treated as invisible? How many stories had he never bothered to ask about? He typed Elena's name into the search engine, not really expecting to find anything. But then something caught his eye. A link to an old concert program from Prague, dated 15 years ago. He clicked on it and there she was, a younger version of Elena, her hair dark and pulled back elegantly, wearing a black concert dress. The program listed her as Elena Konstantinova, pianist performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with the Prague Symphony Orchestra. Richard's hands were shaking as he clicked on another link. Then another. A review from a music magazine calling her performance of Beethoven's sonatas technically brilliant and emotionally devastating. A faculty page from a conservatory showing her as a professor of piano. A photograph of her receiving an award at some music festival. She had not been exaggerating. She had not been trying to make herself sound more important. If anything, she had understated what she once was. Elena had been someone important in her world, someone respected and celebrated, and now she scrubbed his toilets. Richard spent the next 2 hours searching for more information. The trail went cold around 8 years ago. The last mention he could find was an announcement that Professor Konstantinova was taking a leave of absence from the conservatory for personal reasons. After that, nothing. No more concert programs, no more reviews, no more mentions in music circles. It was as if she had simply vanished. When Monday morning came, Richard was exhausted but determined. He had spent the entire weekend thinking about what to do. He had considered calling the agency to find a new housekeeper, which is probably what Elena expected. But every time he thought about doing that, he felt sick to his stomach. Running away from this felt like proving her right about him. At 9 o'clock, he heard the key turn in the lock. Elena let herself in as she always did on her workdays. Richard was waiting in the living room, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater instead of his usual expensive suit. Elena stopped when she saw him, her expression carefully guarded. "Mr. Coleman," she said, "I did not expect you to be home." "I wanted to talk to you," Richard said. He gestured to the couch. "Please sit down." "I should work," Elena said. "Please," Richard repeated. "Just for a few minutes." Elena hesitated, then slowly sat on the edge of the couch, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Richard sat across from her, suddenly unsure how to begin. He had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in his head, but now all his prepared words felt inadequate. "I spent the weekend researching you," he finally said. "I know that probably sounds strange, but I wanted to understand. I found your concert programs, your reviews, your teaching position. You were not just a pianist. You were an incredible pianist." Elena's face remained neutral, but he saw something flicker in her eyes. "So I need to know," Richard continued. "How does someone go from performing with symphony orchestras to cleaning houses? What happened?" For a long moment, Elena said nothing. Richard thought she might refuse to answer, might simply stand up and start her work. But then she took a slow breath and began to speak. "My country had political problems," she said quietly. "The kind of problems that make life dangerous for people who speak their minds. My husband was a journalist.
He wrote articles about government corruption.
One night men came to our home. They did not want to talk." Richard felt his chest tighten. He wanted to say something, but he forced himself to stay quiet and listen. "My husband died that night," Elena continued, her voice steady but her hands gripping each other tightly. "I had a daughter, Katerina. She was 16 years old. After what happened to her father, she stopped eating, stopped sleeping. The doctors said it was severe depression and anxiety. She needed treatment, good treatment, but our country was falling apart. The hospitals were not safe." Elena paused, looking down at her hands. "I knew we had to leave. I sold everything. My piano, my furniture, my grandmother's jewelry. I took Katerina and we came here to America. I thought it would be better. I thought with my education and experience I could find work teaching music, but no one here recognized my degrees. The conservatory in Prague, the awards, the performances, none of it mattered. They told me I would need to go back to school, get American credentials. That takes years and costs thousands of dollars I did not have." "Your daughter," Richard said. "Is she okay now?" Elena's expression softened slightly. "She is better. She is 24 now, studying nursing at community college. The medication she needs is expensive and the therapy is expensive. She still has difficult days, but she is alive. She is healing." "So you clean houses to pay for her treatment," Richard said. "I clean houses to pay for her treatment, her education, our rent, our food, everything," Elena said. "In my country I was respected. Here I am invisible, but my daughter is alive, so I do what I must do." Richard felt something breaking inside him. This woman, who had achieved more in her field than he ever had in his, was scrubbing floors to save her daughter's life. And he had tried to humiliate her for entertainment. "I am so sorry," he said. And this time he meant it with every part of himself, not just for the party, for everything. "For treating you like you did not matter, for never seeing you as a person." Elena studied his face for a long moment. "Many people treat me this way," she said. "You are not special in that regard. When you are poor, when you clean toilets and wash dishes, people look through you like you are glass. I am used to it." "That does not make it right," Richard said. "And I want to do something. I want to help." Elena's expression immediately closed off. "I do not want your charity, Mr. Coleman." "It is not charity," Richard said quickly. "Please just hear me out. I have connections in this city. I know people who run music schools, who organize concerts, who could help you get your credentials recognized. Let me make some calls, set up some meetings. You deserve to be playing piano, not cleaning my kitchen." "And what do you get from this?" Elena asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "A feel-good story? A chance to be the generous rich man who saved the poor immigrant?" The accusation stung because there was some truth in it. Richard had to admit, at least to himself, that part of him did want to fix this. Part of him wanted to be the hero of the story instead of the villain. But there was something else, too. Something deeper. "Maybe at first that is what I wanted," Richard said honestly. "But now I just want to help fix something I should never have broken. You have spent years sacrificing everything for your daughter. Let someone help you for once." Elena stood up. "I need to think about this." "Take all the time you need," Richard said. "But Elena, whether you let me help or not, I want you to know something. You were right about me. I have spent years thinking I was better than everyone else because I made money. But you are worth 10 of me. What you have done for your daughter, the sacrifices you have made, that is real success. Not the expensive apartment or the luxury car, you." For the first time since the party, Elena's carefully controlled expression cracked. Her eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back quickly. "I will think about it," she repeated quietly. Then she picked up her cleaning supplies and went to start her work. Richard sat alone in his living room, hoping desperately that she would give him a chance to make things right. 3 days passed before Elena gave Richard her answer. She arrived for her usual Wednesday shift, and after finishing the kitchen, she found him in his office. He looked up from his computer and she could see the hope in his eyes. It made her uncomfortable. She had spent so many years being invisible that having someone actually see her, actually care, felt foreign and strange. "I will accept your help," she said, standing in the doorway. "But I have conditions." Richard immediately closed his laptop and gave her his full attention. "Of course, whatever you need. First, I continue to work and you continue to pay me. I do not want handouts. Second, if this does not work, if no one will hire me or recognize my credentials, you do not feel guilty. You tried and that is enough. Third, you do not tell people about this to make yourself look good. This is not a story for your business magazine, friends." Richard nodded seriously. "I agree to all of that. I will make some calls today." Elena turned to leave, but Richard stopped her. "Wait, there is something else I want to do first. Something that does not involve anyone else." He stood up and walked to the living room, gesturing for her to follow. When they reached the piano, he pulled out the bench. "Sit," he said. "Please." Elena looked at him suspiciously. "Why?" "Because I want to hear you play again. Not because I am forcing you. Not for anyone's entertainment. Just because you deserve to play music that makes you happy." Elena hesitated. The last time she had sat at this piano, it had been one of the most humiliating moments of her life. But there was something different in Richard's eyes now. He was not looking at her like she was a servant or a curiosity. He was looking at her like she was a person who deserved respect. Slowly, Elena sat down at the bench. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment. Then she began to play. This time she chose something different. Not the dramatic Chopin that had stunned his guests, but something softer. A Brahms lullaby, gentle and sweet. As she played, she thought about Katerina as a baby, how she used to play this piece to help her daughter fall asleep. When she finished, Richard was quiet for a moment. "That was beautiful," he finally said. "Thank you for sharing that." Elena stood up, feeling oddly lighter than she had in months. "I should finish my work." Over the next 2 weeks, Richard became a man on a mission. He made phone calls during his lunch breaks. He set up meetings with people he barely knew. He researched credential recognition programs and contacted music schools across the city. It was harder than he expected. Many places were not interested in evaluating foreign credentials. Others wanted thousands of dollars in fees just to review her documents. Some were outright dismissive when he mentioned she was currently working as a housekeeper, but Richard kept pushing. He called in favors from business contacts. He reached out to Patricia, who knew people in the arts community. Slowly, doors began to open. Meanwhile, something else was changing in Richard's penthouse. He started coming home earlier from work. He began asking Elena questions about her day, about Katerina, about what life was like in Prague before everything fell apart. At first, Elena answered briefly, still unsure if she could trust this new version of her employer. But gradually, she began to open up. She told him about teaching students who went on to perform professionally. She told him about the first time Katerina showed interest in music, banging on toy instruments as a toddler. She told him about her husband, who loved terrible jokes and made her laugh even on her hardest days. Richard found himself looking forward to these conversations. For the first time in years, he was talking to someone about things that actually mattered. Not stock prices or business deals or which restaurant was trendy this month. Real things. Human things. One afternoon, Richard came home with news. "I found someone," he said, barely able to contain his excitement. "Her name is Dr. Helen Chen. She is the director of the Riverside Music Academy. She is originally from Taiwan, and she understands how difficult it can be to get foreign credentials recognized here. She agreed to meet with you." Elena's hand stopped moving. She had been dusting the bookshelf, but now she turned to face him fully. "She will meet with me?" "Next Tuesday at 2 o'clock, Richard said. "I can drive you there if you want, or you can take a car service. Whatever makes you comfortable." Elena sat down slowly on the couch, her cleaning cloth still in her hand. "I do not know what to say." "Say you will go," Richard urged. "Please. This is a real chance." The following Tuesday, Elena stood outside the Riverside Music Academy, her stomach churning with nerves. She wore her best dress, which was not very fancy but was clean and presentable. Richard had offered to come with her, but she had refused. This was something she needed to do alone. Dr. Chen was a small woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She led Elena to her office, which was filled with photographs of students and concert programs from years of performances. "Richard told me about your background," Dr. Chen said, settling into her chair. "I pulled up some of your old reviews online. The 2008 performance of Rachmaninoff in Prague. I remember reading about that. You were extraordinary." Elena felt tears pricking at her eyes. It had been so long since anyone in America had acknowledged her past as real, as valid. That feels like another lifetime. "I understand," Dr. Chen said gently. "When I came here from Taiwan, I had a doctorate in music education. But here, no one cared. I spent 2 years working in a laundromat before I could afford to get my credentials evaluated and translated properly." They talked for over an hour. Dr. Chen asked about Elena's training, her teaching experience, her repertoire. Then she led Elena to a practice room where a beautiful grand piano waited. "Play something for me," Dr. Chen said. "Whatever you want." Elena sat at the piano and closed her eyes. She thought about everything she had lost and everything she had fought to keep. Then she began to play Liszt's Consolation No. 3, a piece about finding peace after suffering. Her fingers remembered every note, every nuance. The music poured out of her like a prayer. When she finished, Dr. Chen was wiping her eyes. "You are the real thing," she said softly. "We need to get you back where you belong." 2 weeks later, Elena arrived at Richard's penthouse with news of her own. He was in the living room when she came in, and he immediately stood up when he saw her face. "What happened?" he asked. "Dr. Chen helped me submit my credentials to the State Evaluation Board. It will take a few months, but she thinks they will recognize my degrees. In the meantime, she offered me a position." Richard's face broke into a huge smile. "That is incredible. What kind of position?" "Teaching. Part-time at first, just a few students. But it is teaching music again. It is what I am meant to do." Elena's voice cracked slightly. "She is also helping me apply for grants to cover the evaluation fees." "Richard, this is really happening." Without thinking, Richard moved forward and hugged her. Elena stiffened for a moment, then slowly hugged him back. When they pulled apart, both of them were crying. "You did this," Elena said. "You opened the door." "No," Richard said firmly. "Your talent did this. Your dedication did this. I just made a few phone calls. You did the hard part. You survived. You never gave up on yourself or your daughter. That is all you." Elena smiled. A real smile, the first one Richard had ever seen on her face. "I need to tell Katerina. She will not believe it." "Go," Richard said. "Go tell her." "And Elena?" "You are fired." Elena's smile faltered. "What?" "You are fired as my housekeeper," Richard said, grinning. "But I hope you will still visit sometimes. As a friend. I could use more friends who tell me the truth about who I am." Elena laughed, wiping her eyes. "I think I can do that." After she left, Richard sat at the piano. He had started taking lessons himself, though he was terrible at it. His teacher said he had no natural talent whatsoever, but he did not care. Every time he sat at this instrument, he remembered what it had taught him, that every person has a story, that success is not measured in money, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply see another person as human. He pressed down on the keys, playing the simple scale his teacher had assigned him for practice. It sounded nothing like the beautiful music Elena created. But he kept playing anyway, one note at a time, learning something new. 6 months passed like a dream Elena was afraid to wake up from. She started teaching 3 students at the Riverside Music Academy, then 5, then 8. Dr. Chen gave her a small studio room with a piano, and every time Elena walked into that space, she felt like she was coming home after years of being lost. Her students adored her. She was patient but demanding, gentle but honest. She taught them that music was not just about hitting the right notes. It was about telling a story, about feeling something deep in your soul and letting it flow through your fingers onto the keys. Parents started requesting her specifically. Word spread that there was a new teacher at Riverside who had performed with symphony orchestras in Europe, who played like an angel and taught with genuine passion. Katerina noticed the change in her mother immediately. Elena smiled more. She hummed while cooking dinner. She had stopped looking constantly tired and worn down. One evening, Katerina hugged her mother tightly and whispered, I have not seen you this happy in years, Mama. Richard kept his promise not to broadcast what he had done. He told no one about helping Elena, not even when his business magazine friend asked for a follow-up interview. But he did make other changes in his life. He started learning the names of everyone who worked in his building. He asked his assistant about her family. He left generous tips and actually looked servers in the eye when he thanked them. People noticed. Patricia told him he seemed different, softer somehow, more real. Richard and Elena did stay friends, just as he had hoped. She came by his penthouse once a week, not to clean, but to have coffee and talk. Sometimes she played the piano for him while he listened. Other times they just sat and discussed their weeks. She told him about her students' progress. He told her about trying to be a better person, and how surprisingly difficult it was to unlearn years of careless behavior. One afternoon in late spring, Elena arrived at Richard's apartment with an envelope in her hands. Her eyes were shining with excitement and nervousness. "What is that?" Richard asked, setting down his coffee cup. "An opportunity," Elena said, sitting down across from him. "Dr. Chen has been talking to people. There is a small concert hall downtown, the Meridian Theater. They host emerging and returning artists. She convinced them to give me a recital." Richard felt his heart jump. "Elena, that is amazing. When?" 2 months from now. June 15th. She paused, biting her lip. "I am terrified. And why?" "You are incredible. You will be perfect." Elena shook her head. "It has been so long since I performed for a real audience. What if my hands shake? What if I forget the pieces? What if people come expecting greatness and I cannot deliver anymore?" Richard leaned forward. "Do you remember what you told me once? You said that you do what you must do. You came to a new country with nothing. You learned a new language. You kept your daughter alive and healthy. You survived years of being treated as invisible, and you never stopped being who you really are. Elena, if you can do all of that, you can absolutely play a concert." Elena smiled, but Richard could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. "Will you come?" "To the recital?" "I would not miss it for anything," Richard said immediately. "And I am bringing people. Everyone who was at that dinner party is getting an invitation. They need to see you shine." The next 2 months were a blur of preparation. Elena practiced for hours every day. She chose her program carefully. Chopin, Brahms, Rachmaninoff, and Liszt, pieces that meant something to her, that told the story of her journey. Dr. Chen helped her prepare mentally, reminding her that she was not trying to prove anything to anyone. She was simply sharing her gift. Katerina helped her mother shop for a concert dress. They found a beautiful deep blue gown that made Elena feel elegant and confident. As they stood together in the dressing room, Katerina squeezed her mother's hand. "Papa would be so proud of you," she said softly. Elena felt tears well up, but blinked them back. "I wish he could be there." "He will be," Katerina said. "In the music. He is always in the music." The night of June 15th arrived warm and clear. Elena stood backstage at the Meridian Theater, her hands trembling slightly as she peeked out at the filling seats. The theater was not huge, maybe 300 seats, but to her it felt like Carnegie Hall. She recognized faces in the audience. Dr. Chen sat in the third row. Several of her students had come with their parents. And there in the center section she saw Richard. He had kept his word. Sitting around him were Patricia, Gregory, and several other faces from that terrible dinner party 6 months ago. But there was someone else too. Richard had brought his assistant, his driver, and even the doorman from his building. He had told Elena once that she taught him everyone has a story worth knowing. Tonight he was showing her that he had actually learned that lesson. A stagehand touched Elena's shoulder. 5 minutes, Ms. Konstantinova." Elena took a deep breath. She thought about everything that had led to this moment. The loss, the struggle, the years of being invisible. And then she thought about what she had gained. Her daughter was healthy and happy. She was teaching again, sharing music with young people who loved it. She had rebuilt a life from ashes. That was worth celebrating. When she walked onto the stage, the applause was warm and welcoming. Elena sat at the piano, adjusted the bench slightly, and placed her hands on the keys. For just a moment, she closed her eyes and said a silent prayer. Then she began to play. The first piece was Chopin's Ballad No. 1, dramatic and powerful. Her fingers flew across the keys with absolute confidence. Every note was exactly where it should be, filled with emotion and technical mastery. As she played, she forgot about the audience. She forgot about her nerves. There was only the music, pouring out of her like water from a spring that had been blocked for too long. She moved through her program, piece after piece, each one more beautiful than the last. The audience sat in absolute silence, captivated. When she reached the final piece, Liszt's Liebestraum, Elena played it as a love letter. To her daughter, to her late husband, to everyone who had survived impossible things and kept going anyway. The final notes rang out in the theater, then faded to silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then the entire audience rose to their feet. The applause was thunderous. People were crying, including Patricia, who was openly wiping tears from her face. Richard was clapping so hard his hands hurt, a huge smile on his face. Elena stood and bowed, overwhelmed by the response. She had forgotten what this felt like. Not just the applause, but the connection. The knowledge that she had reached people, moved them, made them feel something profound through her music. This was who she was. This was what she was meant to do. After the concert, people crowded around to congratulate her. Her students rushed up to hug her. Dr. Chen embraced her with pride. And then Richard made his way through the crowd. He did not say anything at first, just pulled her into a tight hug. "Thank you," he whispered. "I should be thanking you," Elena said, pulling back to look at him. Richard shook his head. "You taught me how to be human again. You showed me that success is not about what you have. It is about who you are and how you treat people. I will never forget that." 3 months later, Elena received official word that her credentials had been fully recognized. Dr. Chen offered her a full-time teaching position with benefits. Elena accepted immediately. She moved to a nicer apartment with Katerina, one with enough space for a small upright piano in the living room. Richard visited their new apartment for dinner one evening. As Elena cooked in the kitchen, Richard sat with Katerina in the living room. She showed him photos from her nursing school clinical rotations, told him about her dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse. "Your mother is an amazing woman," Richard said. "I know," Katerina replied, smiling. "She saved my life, and then she rebuilt her own. She is the strongest person I know." After dinner, Elena played the piano while Richard and Katerina listened. The music filled the small apartment with warmth and beauty. When she finished, Richard stood to leave, but Elena stopped him at the door. "You know what the best part of all this is?" she asked. "What? I am not invisible anymore. Not to my students, not to myself. You helped me remember that I matter, that my story matters. Everyone deserves to be seen that way." Richard nodded, feeling that familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever he really thought about how close he had come to never learning this lesson. "Everyone does, and I promise I will never forget that again." As Richard rode the elevator down, he thought about the $200,000 piano sitting in his penthouse. Elena still came by once a week to play it. But now it was not just an expensive decoration. It had become something meaningful. A reminder that the most valuable things in life are not things at all. They are people, and the stories they carry, and the grace we show when we finally learn to really see each other.